Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer and Nexus MTG coming at you with a deep deck dive look at Esper Control in the format. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these informative Pioneer videos, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below. So if we are starting out, or if we're doing Esper Control, why are we starting out looking at a blue-white control list? Now, blue-white is a deck that we've already explored in one of our deep deck dives. We've talked about its matchups and such, and really using kind of that as a jumping off point for Esper Control. So one of the primary reasons to splash a third color to your deck is to answer problems. One thing blue-white control has historically always had good was it had access to good counter spells, good planeswalkers or good threats, and good sweepers. Historically, throughout Magic's history, one thing blue-white control has often lacked is the most efficient answers to all threats. Now, while it has had things such as Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshares, and now, if you're more familiar with the modern format, things like Solitude and such, and Prismatic Ending, it does not always historically had the most impressive array of removal spells. If you look at the removal spells that see play in a more current blue-white list, you're playing things like Portable Hole, which is obviously an enchantment, which means it's played at sorcery speed and is limited to not only impermanence 2 or less. Fateful Absence can kill planeswalkers or creatures, but your opponent gets a clue token, or whoever it happens to destroy. The March of Otherworldly Life is not the most mana-efficient answer to artifacts, creatures, or enchantments, and while you can pitch cards to make it a little bit more mana efficient, you are losing out on card advantage that way. Now, the power that you are seeing in this list, you're seeing things like Absorb, Supreme Verdict, which is probably one of the best sweepers, especially at 4 mana, and then you're seeing wonderful threats like the Wandering Emperor and Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. Now, these are obviously very powerful things, and if you move to the modern format, you get things like Teferi Time Raveler, a card that's banned in the Pioneer format. Now, looking at the Legacy, the Pioneer version of Esper Control that has started to pop up, you see a lot more efficient answers at earlier things. You're seeing things like Fatal Push, Vanishing Verse, Oath of Kaya, the ability to gain life. You're also seeing Void Ren, which can destroy any non-land permanent and cannot be countered. You're seeing all these wonderful, much more clean answers without giving your opponent advantage. Now, obviously, the flip side is you're making your mana a little bit worse. Now, you're talking about in a format where there are no fetch lands, so you're forced to play, different colors of lands. And the deck recently got a new boon in the form of Rafine's Tower, making the mana a lot cleaner and making it much more interesting to play a 3-color mana base. Beyond that, the decks are largely trying to execute the same plan. They're just having a little bit different tools. Thoughtseize gives you the ability to have hand disruption in addition to counter spells to stopping your opponent. So you're able to poke a hole in your opponent's strategy, not always having to hold up mana to counter every major play they do. Sometimes you can get a little bit of information and take a key card to their strategy. Now, this isn't obviously the best against aggressive decks, but can be very good against some of the problematic matchups that Control can have, such as mono green with all their payoffs, Lotus Field combo, etc. This gives you a little bit of information to gameplay in your next couple of turns after you cast Thoughtseize while disrupting your opponent. You're still getting to play all of the major hits the blue-white does. You're playing things like Dovin's Veto and Absorb. You get to play Memory Deluge, Wandering Emperor, and Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. And then you're still having Supreme Verdict to kind of round up all the idiots after everything. One of the other benefits you get to play is you get to play a man land like Shambling Vent rather than multiple copies of the mono blue land, which I'm drawing a blank on. I believe it's Hall of the Storm Giants, as kind of an additional threat. The downside is you don't get to run quite as many utility lands. Obviously, having the more color-dependent mana base, you're a little bit more focused on your colors. You don't get to run as many Ottawaros and Hall of the Storm Giants and such. Shambling Vent is nice because, number one, it's cheaper to activate, and number two, gives you a little bit of life in a pinch against the aggressive decks, helps to offset all the additional damage you're taking from all the additional shock lands that you're playing. Beyond that, you do get to run a couple of utility lands like a Ganjo and Ottawaro, and you don't run a ton of basics, although some of these versions do run Field of Ruin, which is interesting that they can fit that into the mana base. Sideboard, you also get access to other powerful tools, things like Thought Distortion, which is quite impressive against other control and combo decks, especially Lowest Field emptying out their hand or emptying out the hand of a blue-white control list. Another advantage of Esper over the straight blue-white deck is an advantage in the mirror match. You get in addition to hand disruption in addition to your counter spells. So once again, you kind of get to poke a hole in your opponent's strategy, force them to react, and then you'll have a much better idea of what you're working with. And then you get to play things like Vanishing Verse, which obviously, while it is a little bit conditional, as there are some decks that's just outright terrible against, like Niv-Mizzet, there are a lot of decks playing a lot of monocolor permanents that this makes it easy to think. Kaya is a planeswalker that doesn't see play in all these builds, but it is a nice little value thing. Attacking graveyards, it's decent at attacking cheap permanents, much like a Portable Hole would be, except it's not a planeswalker. And Graveyard Trespasser is a card that you're playing in this list. It's kind of a switch it up strategy while also having your ability to attack graveyards. And then the rest of these things, something that blue-white would have access to. Malevolent Hermit, a cheap disruptive way against combo decks for disruption. Aethergust, pretty good against mono green and mono red. You might bring it in against Rakdos, depending on how many cards you want to board out. Sunset Revelry, very good against the aggressive base decks. So that's one of the main reasons to splash black in your deck, is to get a little bit better, cleaner answers, a little bit better tech against the mirror match and against other combo decks, while making your mana a little bit worse and a little bit more painful against some of the hyper-aggressive decks. Looking at the 60-card version of the deck, now obviously you still get to run all this efficient answers, but you're not playing things like Omen of the Sea. You're still running some numbers of Void Wrens and Vanishing Verses as just clean, efficient answers. And then, obviously, you're still running a lot of the same cards, still running a large amount of lands. This one is choosing not to run the copies of Shambling Vent here, instead just running one Hall of the Storm Giant. So not as much utility in this mana base, obviously, as you're playing a much smaller deck. No Yorion in this build. And on the sideboard, you're still seeing a lot of the same cards. In fact, this version is running no black cards in the sideboard other than one copy of Void Rend. And, obviously Narset, very important in a lot of matchups. Mainly the Control Mirror, decent against Lotus Field, decent against the Izzet-based decks that are really draw-dependent on a lot of cards. Summary Dismissal, interesting way to answer, problematic Eldrazi, just dealing with everything on the stack at once. I'm sure there are other... it's also exiles all their spells, or exiles all their spells and counter all abilities. Nice way to getting around all these uncounterable things like Chandra, the 6-mana Chandra, Awakened Inferno, all these other uncounterable stuff you might see, like whether you have an Izzet player bringing in Niv-Mizzet, etc. And, really a nice copy of Dream Trawler as an anti-creature tech. Quite nice in those racing situations against decks like Mono Red and such. Once again, the deck very similar to the first one we took a look at. Oath of Kai as a way to recoup a little bit of your life loss. Shambling Vent, the same thing. Beyond that, you also get to run Blood Chief's Thirst as another cheap black interaction spell you can run. Not a whole lot different from the first list, but, this is also running some Marches of Otherworldly Light. Gets to play some copies of Farewell as just kind of a catch-all against those decks that just want to put a bunch of permanents in play, whether it be like Red-Black Sacrifice, whether it be different food-based decks like that. Any deck like Greasefang and such, that's just a nice way to clean up the graveyard and all the permanents, catching everything except for Planeswalkers out of the mono green deck. There's just a lot of things the Farewell cleans up that very few other things in the format can just do. Beyond that, you're still running a lot of the same cards. You're seeing Graveyard Trespasser as kind of a change of pace. Narset's Reversal, very important. Mainly against particularly the card Thought Distortion, but can also turn around, if your opponent casts a Dig Through Time or something, you can bounce it back to their hand, get a copy of it yourself, whether your opponents pour over the pages out of the Lowest Field deck, etc. Aethergust we've already kind of talked about. Rest in Peace isn't actual hard graveyard hate, although blue-white can run this. Mystical Dispute has some additional counters against especially the Spirits deck and the mirror matches. Dream Trawler, once again, pretty good against the aggressive decks. Hullbreaker Horror, pretty good in the control mirrors, and no reason not to run Sky Noodle for the most part if you're already going to already have an abundance of cards that you want to run in a lot of these matches. So what are the main points of playing Esper over blue-white specifically? Esper gains some of the percentages that Dimir gains while keeping the strong points of blue-white. Blue-white obviously has the powerful win conditions and the excellent sweepers. and good counter spells while having weaker hard removal. Black gives you access to hand disruption and better clean removal against a lot of things, especially Fatal Push against some of the faster creature decks, with the trade-off being your mana is a little bit more painful and a little bit more clunky sometimes. Now, how much of a trade-off that is, it's really kind of hard to say. It should help improve some of your bad matchups, particularly the combo and control mirrors. One of the things Dimir has always been kind of done well is it's always been the hunter of its bigger brother, blue-white control. Because you have that mixture of hand disruption and counter spells, which makes the control mirror a lot better. While blue-white historically in more recent years has had access to the better actual finishers, things like the Wandering Emperor, Teferi Time Raveler, Teferi Hero Dominaria, has had access to more of the utility pieces. So you get to kind of meld the good characteristics of Dimir, which we have not covered yet, but you get to meld the good characteristics of blue-white and blue-black in the format, and kind of get this very powerful hard control deck that can pivot to answer almost anything, but still has some of the same weaknesses as blue-white control. Now, while your removal gets a lot better, you are taking a little bit more damage. So any deck that can leverage a large amount of pressure early that is somehow resilient. So, a deck like Heroic with a protection spell or two, mono red aggro, spirits to a certain extent, especially the mono and blue variants. These decks that if they can protect you, from the first interaction piece or two you might have, especially if you say go thought or fatal push into say absorb, very similar to the opening blue-white would have, these decks can get under you and leverage their ability to close the game out, especially since your mana might be a little bit awkward in those first couple of turns. The power that Esper gets is the longer the game goes, it becomes even slightly more powerful than blue-white control. Now, whether the trade-off is worth the extra damage in your lands, a lot of it depends on your meta. If a lot of your meta is mid-range and control decks, Esper's a lot better. To be able to punch a hole with Thoughtseize, to have access to, these different hard answers at instant speed. You're not fooling around with things like Fateful Absence and giving your opponent back a clue token. You're going to instead Vanishing Verse whatever that permanent was. You're going to Void Bren whatever that permanent was. Instead of having to play Portable Hole, you're playing Fatal Push so you can hold up mana at instant speed. There's a lot of advantages to it, but whether it's really kind of hard to say if it's the best version of control. It's a little bit weaker against the more aggressive base decks that can protect themselves, but it's a little bit better, especially in those matchups that can be difficult. Things like mono green gives you a little bit more information about what you're doing and a little bit cleaner answers at times. Decks like Lotus Field, where counter spells aren't enough, and oftentimes they can bully you with, superior mana. This gives you the ability to Thoughtseize on a key turn and maybe take a key card from them, get a little bit more information about what your opponent's doing. And then against decks like Red Black, whereas Blue White Control can have a large amount of problems, with a deck that's overloading on Thoughtseizes and Go Blanks and all these other resilient threats. Esper is much more better able to play Battle Cruiser Magic. They're a deck that can, answer things one for one much more cleanly than Blue-White Control, especially with hard permanents like Planeswalkers and such. They can sometimes be difficult for Blue-White to answer once they've resolved. That said, there are trade-offs. You're a little bit weaker against the hyper-aggressive decks that can get under you. You're a little bit better in answering the slower aggro decks, a little bit better against the combo decks because you have access to the black hand disruption, and you're a little bit better in the mirror match. A lot of it still comes down to skill and stuff, but I've found historically when I've played Esper, I've always felt kind of ahead in the control-esque mirrors, and then I find when I'm playing blue-white against Esper, I feel like I'm a ton behind, so maybe it's just personal bias as far as my preferences, but I know if I have a chance that I'd be playing Esper over blue-white any day of the week. Maybe it's a handicap, I don't know, but I find Esper to be the most interesting of the 4 control variants in the Pioneer format, but whether it's the best or not, kind of up to you to decide. But I just wanted to give you kind of the key differences between blue-white and maybe where it helps to improve matchups and such. So this has been John for Pioneer Nexus MTG. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and also let me know down below what deck you'd like to see us cover next.